The last request of the season came from a house that had vanished from every map. It appeared on a small cream-coloured card in the return box of the Bellwether Floating Library, written in a careful hand with blue ink, one copy of the Country Book of Stars, to be delivered before the first frost, to the Lantern House on Hush Island. There was no name beneath the request, no telephone number, and no note explaining how the card had reached the return box. There was only a tiny drawing of a lantern in the lower corner and, beneath it, 3 words, "Come before dark." Mara Vale found the card on a quiet October morning, while the harbour was still covered in pale mist. She stood inside the narrow cabin of the library boat, holding the card near the round window, and listened to water touching the hull with the soft, regular sound of someone turning pages in another room. The Bellwether was not a large boat. It had once carried mail among the islands of northern New England, and some of its old brass pigeonholes still lined the wall behind the captain's chair. Now the pigeonholes held library cards, pencils, twine, spare buttons, and smooth stones that children had traded for bookmarks. Shelves ran along both sides of the cabin, each one fitted with a low wooden rail so the books would remain in place when the lake became restless. There were mysteries near the bow, cookbooks beside the little stove, gardening books beneath a window, and novels everywhere else. Mara had worked aboard the Bellwether for 6 years, and during those years she had learned every inhabited island, every reliable dock, every hidden cove where the wind could not follow. She knew the blue cottage on Alder Island, the weathered farm on North Reed, the little schoolhouse on Maple Key, and the old hotel on St. Aura, where the same 3 guests returned each summer. But she did not know the Lantern House, and she had never heard of Hush Island. She brought the card to Elias, the harbour keeper, who was sitting beneath the office awning with a mug of coffee warming both hands. Elias had kept the harbour longer than anyone could remember. He knew which boats leaked, which ropes had been mended too many times, and which clouds meant rain before noon. He placed the request card on his knee and studied it through his glasses. "Hush Island," he said at last. "That is an old name." He looked across the harbour, where masts rose through the thinning mist. "Very old." Mara waited. Elias was a man who never hurried a memory. He took a quiet sip of coffee and turned the card over, although the back was blank. "People call it Little Heron now," he continued. "It sits beyond the North Narrows, almost against the Vermont shore. No public dock, no electric line. There used to be a keeper's cottage on the east point, with a lamp in its upper window. The steamers watched for it before they turned toward the channel." "That might be your Lantern House." "Used to be?" Mara asked. "The cottage has been empty for 40 years. Elias returned the card. His expression was not worried. It was thoughtful, the way a person looks when a familiar song has begun in a distant room. Or, "I thought it was." Mara looked again at the small lantern drawn in blue ink. The request was strange, but nothing about it felt dangerous. It felt patient. It felt as though someone had been waiting a long time and had finally decided to ask for exactly what they needed. Back aboard the Bellwether, Mara searched the shelves until she found the Country Book of Stars between a guide to migrating birds and a book about old apple varieties. It was a wide, cloth-bound volume, dark blue with faded silver letters. When she opened it, the pages smelt faintly of cedar and dust. The drawings inside were simple, winter constellations, summer constellations, the turning earth, the wandering moon. On the final page, a previous reader had pressed a tiny fern. Mara closed the book gently and wrapped it in brown paper, tying it with blue string to match the ink on the request card. Then she prepared the boat for the final northern route of the year. She filled the kettle, checked the fuel, laid a wool blanket across the bench, and placed a basket of oat biscuits beside the stove. She tucked the star book into the dry cabinet behind her chair. By then, the mist had lifted. The lake opened beyond the harbour in long bands of silver and quiet blue. Red maples stood along the hillsides like low, steady flames, and the white houses of the town shone among them. A bell rang once from the bakery door. Somewhere behind the boatyard, a dog barked and then seemed to reconsider the need. Mara untied the stern rope, then the bow rope, coiled both neatly, and stepped into the cabin. The old engine woke with a soft, dependable tremor. Elias raised his mug from the dock. Mara raised one hand in return, and the bellwether moved away from the harbour. The town slipped slowly behind her. First, the bakery chimney disappeared, then the church steeple, then the red roof of the harbour office. Ahead lay a whole day of familiar stops before the North Narrows and the unknown island beyond. Mara did not mind. A mysterious destination was easier to approach when there were ordinary errands along the way. She opened the route ledger and read the names of the day's readers, Mrs. Day. Finch, on Alder Island, 12 books. The Bell Twins on Maple Key, 6 books and a globe. Daniel Wren at the Northreed Farm, 3 repair manuals and a novel. Miss Alma at the Old Hotel, 1 book of poems. Below those names, in her own handwriting, she added, Lantern House, Hush Island, 1 book of stars. The bellwether passed the final green buoy and entered the broad lake. Small waves spread from the bow in even folds. Above, a flock of geese travelled south in a loose and changing line, their calls falling softly through the clear air. Mara watched until they became dark marks above the hills. Then she set the wheel toward Alder Island, where a thin ribbon of chimney smoke was rising through the trees. The sun climbed behind her, warm enough to brighten the cabin, but not warm enough to erase the coolness that lived in the corners. She buttoned her brown sweater at the neck and rested one hand on the polished wheel. For a while, there was nothing to do but follow the open water. The engine hummed. The shelves gave an occasional wooden creak. A teaspoon in the galley drawer made one small silver sound whenever the boat leaned left. Mara had heard these sounds so often that they felt less like noises than companions. Together, they crossed the morning lake, carrying stories from one quiet shore to another. Alder Island was shaped like a curled leaf, with its only dock tucked into the sheltered space between 2 wooded points. Mrs. Finch was already waiting there in a red coat, a canvas bag at her feet and a grey cat sitting beside her as solemnly as a second patron. She caught the bow rope when Mara tossed it and looped it around the post with practised hands. "Last run north?" she asked. "Last one before winter," Mara said. Mrs. Finch sighed in the satisfied way people do when a season has completed its work. She passed over the canvas bag, heavy with returned books, and stepped aboard to choose replacements. The grey cat remained on the dock, looking through the cabin window. Mrs. Finch liked biographies, garden journals, and mysteries in which the village baker solved everything before the constable did. She moved slowly along the shelves, pulling out a book, reading the first paragraph, and sliding it back. Mara checked in the returns and stamped the new due date cards. The stamp made a small, dry tap against the desk. Outside, yellow birch leaves drifted across the cove and landed without a sound. "Do you know a lantern house?" Mara asked. Mrs. Finch paused with a book open in her hands. "On Little Heron? That may be the place." "Of course, Mrs. the place." Finch closed the book around one finger to keep her page. "My grandmother took me there for tea when I was 7. The woman who lived there made rosehip jelly and kept a lamp burning in the attic window. Ada Rowan. She had a daughter about my age, I think. Ruth. I was told the cottage was empty. It was after Ada died. Ruth went away. But houses are patient things. They can wait longer than people." Mrs. Finch selected 12 books, exactly as the ledger had predicted. Before leaving, she placed a small jar of apple butter on Mara's desk, a yearly gift for the final route. The jar was still warm from the kitchen. "If someone has returned to the lantern house," she said, "tell them Eleanor Finch remembers the blue cups." Then she stepped onto the dock, gathered her books, and walked toward the path, with the grey cat following close behind. Mara watched until Redcoat and Greytail disappeared among the birches. She wrote Ruth Rowan beside the Lantern House entry in the ledger, adding a question mark, then pushed away from the dock. The cove released the bellwether back onto the lake. By late morning, the sun had turned the water a deeper blue. The wind had softened, and far to the west, the mountain ridges stood in layers, each paler than the one before. Mara steered between two low islands, where reeds whispered along the shore. The channel was narrow enough that she could smell fallen leaves warming in the sun. A kingfisher crossed ahead of the boat, low and quick, then settled on the bent branch of a pine. Beyond the channel, Maple Key came into view. Its schoolhouse stood above the dock, white paint bright between orange trees. Only 9 children attended the island school, and on library days they watched the lake from the classroom windows. As soon as the bellwether rounded the point, the door opened and the children came down the path in a line that quickly became something less orderly. Their teacher, Mr. Bell, followed with a wooden crate of returns. His twin daughters, June and Ivy, carried a large cardboard tube between them. They had spent the month drawing a map of imaginary islands, and they wanted Mara to judge whether the map should be shelved with geography or fiction. Both, Mara decided after examining the sea monsters, compass roses, and carefully measured coastlines. The best maps usually are. The twins approved this answer. Inside the cabin, the children settled into familiar corners. One sat beneath the history shelf. 2 shared the little bench by the stove. A younger boy lay on the rug and studied a book about beetles. Voices fell naturally to whispers, not because Mara required silence, but because the close walls and waiting books seemed to suggest it. Mr. Wonder, Bell returned the crate, then helped Mara carry out the globe requested for the classroom. It was an old globe, the colour of honey, mounted in a walnut frame. The children gathered around it on the dock. They turned it gently, stopping oceans with their fingertips. "Can you find Hush Island on there?" June asked after Mara mentioned her final destination. "This globe shows the whole world," Mr. Bell explained. "Hush Island would be smaller than the dot made by a pin." "Then how does the world know it is there?" Ivy asked. Mr. Bell considered. Perhaps because someone remembers it. The children grew quiet for a moment, thinking about places too small for globes. Then the youngest found the beetle book again, and attention moved elsewhere. Before the bellwether left, June gave Mara a folded paper lantern no larger than a walnut. "For the house," she said. Ivy added a short piece of red thread so it could be hung in a window. Mara placed it beside the wrapped book of stars. The little object stood upright despite every movement of the boat. From Maple Key, the route turned northwest toward North Reed, a broad island of old fields, stone walls, and a single working farm. Clouds began to gather in thin white layers, but the day remained bright. Mara warmed soup on the stove as she travelled. It was squash soup with nutmeg and a little cream, poured that morning into a blue enamel pot. When steam fogged the nearest window, she opened it the width of 2 fingers. Cool air slipped in, carrying the clean mineral smell of the lake. She ate at the desk while the boat followed a straight, easy course. A few oat biscuits completed the meal. She left the apple butter closed, saving it for evening. The approach to North Reed was marked by an abandoned stone pier and an orchard descending almost to the water. Many of the trees were older than the farmhouse. Their trunks leaned in different directions, but their branches still carried small red apples. Daniel Wren waited beside a green wheelbarrow. His sheep grazed in the field behind him, pale shapes among the grass. He had repaired the island dock the previous spring, and the bellwether rested against its new bumpers without a knock. Daniel returned 3 manuals and a novel, all wrapped in a flour sack to keep them clean. The repair books had taught him how to restore the orchard cider press. "It turns again," he told Mara. Slowly, but that may be the correct speed for an old machine. He handed her a bottle of cider, cloudy gold beneath the glass. In exchange, Mara brought out his new manuals and the long novel he had requested for winter. Daniel tested the weight of the novel in his hand. "This should last until February. Only if you sleep sometimes," Mara said. "No promises." When she asked about the lantern house, Daniel leaned against the wheelbarrow and looked north. "I saw smoke there 3 mornings ago," he said. "Just a little. I assumed someone was clearing brush." "Did you see a boat?" A green canoe pulled above the shore. He thought for a moment. "The North Passage is deep enough, but go around the western shoal. The marker is gone, and the rocks sit close beneath the surface." Mara thanked him. Daniel added 6 apples to her growing collection of gifts and returned to the orchard, pushing the wheelbarrow along the grass. The sheep raised their heads as he passed, then lowered them again. At the end of the dock, Mara stood for a moment with one hand on the rail. North of the farm, the lake narrowed between dark, wooded shores. Somewhere beyond those shores waited an island too small for a globe, a green canoe, a thread of chimney smoke, and perhaps a woman named Ruth Rowan, who remembered blue cups. The mystery was becoming less mysterious, which pleased Mara. Most mysteries, when approached patiently, became people carrying groceries, opening windows, lighting stoves, and looking for something good to read. She returned to the wheel, started the engine, and guided the bellwether away from North Reed. The orchard moved past the window, each old tree holding its few bright apples against the afternoon sky. Then the island fell behind, and the North Narrows opened ahead. The North Narrows were quiet enough for Mara to hear drops of water falling from the bellwether's bow after each small wave. The shores drew close on either side, steep with cedar and hemlock. Sunlight reached the channel in long golden pieces. Here and there, a fallen tree stretched over the water, its roots holding a dark cake of earth above the bank. Mara slowed the engine and watched the depth gauge. Daniel's warning about the western shoal had been useful. She kept to the eastern side until the channel widened, then followed a line of black cormorants resting on a pale rock. Beyond them, little heron appeared. At first it seemed no different from a dozen uninhabited islands, a low ridge of spruce, a narrow beach, a scatter of grey stones. Then the bellwether rounded the eastern point, and Mara saw the house. It stood partway up the slope beneath 3 tall pines. Weather had softened its white paint, but the roof was sound, the chimney straight, and every window held a square of afternoon light. Above the main roof rose a small attic room with windows on 3 sides. A brass lantern hung inside the east window. Below, on the beach, a green canoe rested upside down between 2 logs. A woman in a blue coat waited on the stone landing. She was perhaps 60, perhaps 70, with silver hair pinned loosely behind her head. Beside her sat a wooden crate marked books in faded red letters. She lifted one hand when the boat approached. Mara eased the bellwether against the landing, stepped outside, and took the rope the woman offered. "You found us," the woman said. Her voice held relief, but also amusement, as though she had never seriously doubted it. "The map nearly disagreed," Mara replied. "Maps often do." The woman secured the rope and introduced herself as Ruth Rowan. Mara felt a small inner door close gently on the mystery. The name fit where she had left the question mark. Ruth had spent most of her life in Oregon, she explained, working as a bookbinder and teacher. She had returned in September to repair her mother's cottage and decide what should become of it. The request card had travelled to town in the pocket of a carpenter who promised to place it in the library box. He had forgotten the promise until the previous week. "And the words come before dark?" Mara asked. Ruth smiled and looked toward the attic window. "A practical request, not a ghostly one. The old landing is difficult to see after sunset. I worried the card sounded dramatic when it was already too late to change it." She lifted the crate. These were my mother's library books. Or perhaps they belonged to the library before they belonged to my mother. I hoped you could tell me. Together, they carried the crate into the bellwether. Inside were 24 books, each protected by a paper cover. The due dates told a quiet history. Some had been borrowed in the 1960s, others in the 70s, and the final one in October of 1981. No fines had been recorded because the floating library had suspended its northern route during the year Ada Rowan became ill. Afterward, no one had remembered where the books had gone. Mara ran a finger over the old cards. "They have been waiting too," she said. "Would you like them back?" "For the cottage?" Ruth asked. "A permanent loan? 40 years seems a reasonable test." Ruth laughed softly. "Then yes, very much." Mara brought out The Country Book of Stars. Ruth received the wrapped volume with both hands and touched the blue string. "My granddaughter is coming tomorrow," she said. "She grew up under city lights. She has never seen the Milky Way clearly. The forecast says the sky will be clear tonight and tomorrow. I wanted to learn the constellations before she arrived, though at my age I may need to greet them more than once." Mara also gave her the folded paper lantern from June and Ivy. Ruth held it up to the window, delighted by its tiny, precise folds. "Then the lantern house has 2 lamps again." She tied the red thread around a brass hook above the desk. The paper lantern turned slowly in the warm air from the stove. Mara remembered the message from Alder Island. "Eleanor Finch remembers the blue cups." Ruth became still, then her whole face softened. "Eleanor," she said. "She had a grey cat named Pebble. She has another grey cat now." "That seems right." Ruth invited Mara up to the cottage for tea. There was time before the last scheduled stop, and the light would remain for several hours. So Mara locked the cabin and followed her along a path edged with ferns. The air beneath the pines smelled cool and green. Near the house, a small garden had gone mostly to seed. Dry heads of black-eyed Susans nodded above the stone border. Rose hips glowed red along the fence. Ruth opened the kitchen door, and Mara stepped into a room that seemed to have been quietly holding its breath. A black stove gave off steady heat. Copper pans hung above a deep white sink. On open shelves stood 6 blue cups, their glaze the colour of the lake just before rain. Ruth filled the kettle and set it on the stove. While they waited, she unwrapped the star book and turned its pages at the table. The pressed fern on the final page made her smile. "My mother put ferns in everything," she said. "Books, letters, dresser drawers. Once she packed one into my lunch." "Was it edible?" "Not the fern. Fortunately, there was also a sandwich." The kettle began its slow approach to boiling. Ruth spooned tea into a brown pot, poured the water, and covered the pot with a knitted cozy. From a tin she brought out molasses cookies, dark and soft. They drank from the blue cups at a round table by the window. The tea tasted of mint and something floral Mara could not name. From the kitchen, the bellwether was visible below, red roof bright against the stones. Beyond it, the lake extended south between wooded shores. "Why Hush Island?" Mara asked. Ruth warmed her hands around her cup. "That was my mother's name for it. The official name changed more than once. Surveyors called it Parcel 7. A lumber company called it North Heron. The county settled on Little Heron. But when evening came, my mother said the island asked every visitor to hush because the lake was telling its long story. I believed her." Mara listened. Wind moved lightly over the roof, and a branch brushed the outer wall with a soft sweep. The kettle settled on the stove. Far below, water reached the stones and withdrew. "I still do," Ruth added. They finished their tea without hurry. Before Mara left, Ruth carried the brass lantern upstairs and placed it in the attic window. She did not light it yet. The sun still stood above the western hills. But the clear glass caught the afternoon and held it, a small bright shape visible from the path. Ruth promised to send a new request list before spring, and Mara promised that Hush Island would appear in the Bellwether's next route ledger. At the landing, they loosened the rope. Ruth stood on the stones with the wrapped starbook beneath one arm. "Thank you for returning the house to the map," she said. "I think it returned itself," Mara answered. Then the Bellwether backed slowly from the landing. Ruth raised her hand. The white cottage, the blue coat, and the green canoe grew smaller as the boat entered the channel. In the attic window, the unlit lantern shone with borrowed sunlight. Mara looked at the route ledger and crossed out the question mark after Ruth Rowan's name. The final line now read simply, "Lantern House, Hush Island, 1 book of stars, delivered." The Bellwether travelled south with the afternoon behind it. The North Narrows, which had seemed secretive on the way in, now appeared welcoming and familiar. Sunlit patches moved across the water. Cedars leaned over their own reflections. Mara let the boat proceed at its most comfortable speed, neither hurrying the engine nor asking the hull to push a larger wave than necessary. She tidied the desk as she went. The blue string from the starbook was folded and placed in a drawer. The empty soup pot was rinsed with water from the kettle. Ruth's returned crate of books rested securely beneath the table, although in Mara's mind they had already been returned to the cottage. She would renew them all for a very long season. On the ledger, she added a note to bring Eleanor Finch a letter in spring. Ruth had written it at the kitchen table while the tea steeped, using the same blue ink as the request card. The envelope lay now in a brass pigeonhole, addressed simply to Eleanor on Alder Island. No street was needed. The library route had its own kind of postal system, held together by docks, memory, and the expectation that Mara would eventually pass every door. The water widened. North Reed appeared far to the east, its orchard a russet patch above the shoreline. Daniel had gone indoors, but a pair of sheep remained near the dock. They watched the red-roofed boat pass with mild, unhurried interest. Mara raised a hand to them, because the day had become the sort of day on which this seemed reasonable. One sheep turned away to eat. The other remained still until distance made it small. The final scheduled stop lay on St. Aura, a long island near the centre of the lake. A hotel had stood there since the steamer years, first grand, then unfashionable, then nearly forgotten, and now quietly beloved by people who preferred worn floors and wide porches to elevators and polished stone. The season had ended 2 weeks earlier. White sheets covered the dining room furniture, rowboats rested upside down on the lawn, and most shutters were closed. But Miss Alma, the owner, stayed through every winter. She occupied 3 rooms beside the kitchen and kept one upstairs bedroom ready in case a traveller crossed the frozen lake needing shelter. When the Bellwether approached the hotel dock, Mara saw Alma seated in a wicker chair at the far end of the porch. A rust-coloured blanket covered her knees. On the table beside her, a cup sent a thread of steam into the cooling air. She lifted a brass handbell and rang it once. Its clear note travelled over the lawn and across the water. Mara answered with one brief sound from the boat's horn. At the dock, Alma did not come down. She was 88 and had decided several years ago that ramps were inventions best appreciated from a distance. Mara carried the requested poetry book up the path. Leaves lay across the hotel steps, each one flat and bright as a pressed flower. The front door stood open, and the hall beyond smelled of beeswax, old pine boards, and the faint cinnamon sweetness of something baking in the kitchen. "You are late," Alma said when Mara reached the porch. "I discovered an island. That is an acceptable excuse." Mara placed the poetry book on the table. Alma touched its green cover, then pointed to the second chair. "Sit. The cake requires 10 more minutes, and 10 minutes cannot be improved by standing." Mara sat. From the porch they could see nearly the whole southern lake. Maple Key was hidden behind a ridge, but the mainland hills rose beyond it, blue beneath the lengthening shadows. The Bellwether waited at the dock, its cabin windows reflecting the sky. "Which island?" Alma asked. Little Heron, though the person who lives there calls it Hush Island. Ada Rowan's place. Her daughter Ruth has come back. Alma nodded without surprise. People do. Sometimes their bodies return first and their hearts arrive later. Sometimes the other way around. She opened the poetry book and read its table of contents. Alma never asked for a particular author. She sent Mara a desired colour, and Mara chose the book. This month, the request had been green. In September, it had been gold. During the longest part of winter, it was usually red. From inside came the quiet ring of the kitchen timer. Alma closed the book. There! The 10 minutes have completed themselves. They went into the kitchen. The room was large enough to prepare dinner for 100 guests, but Alma used only one corner in winter. A small table stood beside a small stove. A copper kettle, 2 mugs, and a jar of tea occupied one shelf. On the table, cooling in a square pan, was ginger cake with a dark, gently cracked surface. Alma cut 2 pieces and wrapped one in waxed paper for Mara's journey. The other she divided between 2 plates. They ate beside the window while the last sunlight moved from the upper branches of the maples. The cake was soft and warm, with bits of pear baked into it. Alma asked no further questions about the mysterious request. She seemed to understand that a story, like bread, sometimes needed to rest before being handled again. Instead, she spoke about closing the hotel. The porch cushions had been washed and stored. The silver had been wrapped. 72 pillowcases had dried on the line in a single windy afternoon. A plumber would visit on Tuesday to check the pipes. These details were plain and restful. Each represented a task completed, a cupboard closed, a room prepared to sleep through snow. When the plates were empty, Mara carried them to the sink. Alma objected only once, as custom required, then allowed her to wash them. The water ran hot over the blue and white china. Mara placed each plate on the wooden rack and wiped the table with a folded cloth. Outside, the sunlight narrowed to a copper band above the western mountains. It was time to go. Alma walked with her as far as the porch. She tucked the green poetry book beneath the rust-coloured blanket and settled again into the wicker chair. "Will you be comfortable here all winter?" Mara asked, although she knew the answer. "I have wood, tea, a green book, and 87 empty rooms if I become bored with my own. I will manage." Mara smiled. "Ring the bell if you need anything. You may hear it from town if the wind behaves." Alma raised one hand in farewell. Mara followed the leaf-covered path to the dock. The bellwether's deck had cooled beneath the shadow of the island. Inside the cabin, she lit the small lamp above the desk and placed the wrapped ginger cake beside the apples. Then she started the engine. The boat pulled away, turning toward the open southern water. Behind her, the hotel porch became a narrow, pale line between dark trees. Alma's rust-coloured blanket made one warm square at its centre. The brass bell did not ring again. It rested on the table beside her, ready but unneeded. Evening settled over the lake by degrees so gentle that Mara could not have said when the day ended. Gold faded from the western sky. The water changed from blue to pewter, then from pewter to a dark colour that seemed to contain all the trees and mountains at once. The first star appeared above the bow. For several minutes it was alone, then a second emerged near it, and a third higher to the east. Mara dimmed the desk lamp until it gave only enough light to show the compass and the open route ledger. The southern channel was broad and well marked. Red and green lights waited at long intervals, each reflection stretching toward the boat in a trembling line. The engine maintained its low, steady rhythm. Books filled the cabin with their quiet weight. The empty places on the shelves where the day's selections had been made small, dark gaps that would be filled again in spring. Mara buttoned her sweater once more and laid the wool blanket across her knees. There was no need to stand. The captain's chair had been shaped by years of use, and it held her comfortably as the boat travelled. She unwrapped Alma's ginger cake and broke off a small piece. It tasted even more strongly of pear now that it had cooled. She opened the apple butter from Mrs. Finch and spread a little on an oat biscuit. Last, she poured half a cup of Daniel's cider. In this way, the islands accompanied her home. Orchard, porch, kitchen and cove gathered on the little desk beneath the lamp. She thought of the school globe turning beneath the children's hands. The lake had not appeared on it, except perhaps as the smallest scratch of blue. The islands were invisible. The bellwether was more invisible still. Yet here they all were, complete beneath the stars. The boat passed Maple Key at a distance. A worn rectangle marked the schoolhouse window. Mr. Bell often prepared lessons in the evening after the children had gone home, and Mara imagined him placing the old globe on a shelf, perhaps turned so that the small hidden lake faced outward. Near the island's southern point, 2 porch lights shone among the trees. Then the shoreline folded and they disappeared. Open water returned. Mara checked the compass, adjusted the wheel by the width of one finger, and settled back. There was a particular calm in a journey after every errand had been completed. Nothing remained to collect, explain, find, or deliver. The boat knew the direction. The harbour would wait. Even the cold stayed outside the cabin windows, where it belonged. Mara let her breathing fall into the pace of the engine, in while the bow lifted, out while it settled, in as a small wave opened beneath the hull, out as the water closed again behind it. She did not count the breaths. There was nowhere to reach by counting. Above her, the sky deepened. The Milky Way became visible as a pale road laid across the darkness. Mara thought of Ruth at the lantern house, with the star book open on the kitchen table. Perhaps she had carried one of the blue cups upstairs. Perhaps she was standing in the attic room, comparing the book's simple drawings with the enormous patient sky. She would find the North Star, then the bent shape of the Great Bear, then the bright W of Cassiopeia. If she forgot their names, the stars would remain. If she closed the book, they would remain. Tomorrow her granddaughter would arrive in the green canoe, or perhaps with the carpenter in his small motorboat, carrying an overnight bag, a warm hat, and the ordinary brightness of someone seeing a family place for the first time. Ruth would show her the rose hips, the blue cups, the paper lantern, and the old library books that had waited 40 years to be borrowed again. When night returned, they would go to the attic together. The girl would look upward into a sky without city light, and Ruth would open the Country Book of Stars. Whether they named every constellation correctly did not matter. They would have the same view Ada once watched, and the same dark lake around them, and a lamp in the window to mark their small place in it. The idea made Mara feel warm despite the cold glass beside her. Far behind, beyond St. Aura and North Reed and the twisting Narrows, a faint point of amber appeared near the horizon. It was too low to be a star, and too steady to be a boat. Mara knew it was the lantern house. Ruth had lit the brass lamp. For a long while, the light remained visible between the dark shoulders of the islands. It did not flash or call attention to itself. It simply stayed. Then the bellwether turned slightly south. A wooded point moved across the line of sight, and the light was gone. Mara did not look back again. A light did not need to remain visible in order to guide someone. Sometimes it was enough to know where it had been. The night air grew colder. A thin edge of frost began to gather at the lower corner of the forward window, drawing white fern shapes across the glass. Mara smiled when she noticed them. Ada Rowan, who had pressed ferns into books and letters and lunches, would have approved of winter making one of its own. The frost spread slowly, branch by branch, never entering the clear circle warmed by the cabin. Through that circle, Mara watched the channel markers approach and pass. Each light became bright, slipped beside the boat, then diminished behind. Time moved in the same quiet way. A few minutes, another marker. A few more, the outline of a familiar hill. The ginger cake became half a piece, then a wrapped corner saved for morning. The cider cup became empty. The engine continued. At Alder Island, Mrs. Ound. Finch's cottage stood dark, except for one lamp in an upstairs room. Mara slowed as she crossed the mouth of the cove. She imagined Ruth's letter resting in the pigeonhole behind her, travelling toward its reader, even while the boat seemed to be travelling away. In spring, Mrs. Spring. Finch would stand at the dock in her red coat. The grey cat would sit beside her. Mara would give her the blue envelope, and perhaps later that summer the bellwether would carry Eleanor north to drink tea from the cup she remembered. There was no need to decide the details tonight. Spring was good at making its own arrangements. For now, Alder Island slept. The cat, the cottage, the birches, and the curled-leaf shore rested beneath a sky bright with stars. Mara brought the engine back to its usual speed. South of Alder, the first lights of town appeared. They were scattered at first. A farmhouse on the eastern hill, a porch near the water, the white lamp above the railway crossing. Then more gathered around the harbour. The church steeple rose as a darker shape among them. A thread of smoke lifted from the bakery chimney, visible only when it crossed the moon. Mara could almost smell tomorrow's bread already beginning in the warm kitchen. She passed the outer green buoy. The water inside the harbour was smooth, protected from the open lake by two long stone arms. Here the bellwether's wake spread in slow, even curves and touched the moored boats. Ropes tightened softly against cleats. A mast fitting chimed once. Another answered farther down the dock. Elias had left the harbour office lamp burning. When Mara drew alongside, he stepped outside wearing a wool cap and carrying two lines. He caught the bow, then the stern, and secured them without conversation. Only after the engine stopped did he ask, was the house there? The sudden quiet settled around them. Without the engine, Mara could hear water ticking against the cooling hull and dry leaves moving along the dock. The house was there, she said, and someone was waiting. Elias nodded, satisfied. Most houses prefer that. He helped her carry the crate of old books into the harbour office, where they would remain dry until Mara renewed and catalogued them in the morning. When she explained that they were going back to Hush Island, he nodded again. 40 years late did not seem unusual to a harbour keeper. Wind, weather, and people all kept their own calendars. He accepted one of Daniel's apples, polished it on his sleeve, and wished Mara good night. The office door closed. Its red roof was almost black beneath the stars. Mara returned to the bellwether alone for the final tasks. She turned off the navigation lights, emptied the kettle, and swept 3 biscuit crumbs from the desk into her palm. She checked every window latch. She straightened the wool blanket and placed it on the bench. The route ledger went into its drawer. Before closing it, she read the final page once more. Every name had a neat mark beside it. Mrs. Finch, delivered. Maple Key School, delivered. Daniel Wren, delivered. Miss Alma, delivered. Lantern House, delivered. Nothing remained unfinished. Mara closed the drawer. Without the desk lamp, the cabin became a narrow room of silver shadows. Moonlight touched the rails of the shelves and the round brass edges of the old pigeonholes. Ruth's letter waited in one. The folded blue string waited in another. A smooth green stone left by a child rested near the compass. All these small objects would stay exactly where they were until morning. Mara put on her coat and stepped onto the dock. Frost was already forming on the boards, not enough to make them slippery, only enough to brighten the grain. The first frost had arrived, just as the request card had predicted. Mara locked the cabin door and placed one hand briefly against the red-painted frame. The bellwether moved almost imperceptibly on its ropes, settling into its berth after the long route. It seemed tired in the pleasant way. A useful thing can be tired, with every shelf lighter and every errand done. Mara walked up the dock. Her footsteps were quiet. At the harbour gate she turned once and looked back. The library boat rested among the sailboats, small and dark beneath the moon. Beyond the stone breakwater lay the long route north, Alder, Maple Key, North Reed, St. Aura, and Hush Island, each invisible now but held in its proper place by water and memory. Somewhere in the distance, the lantern house glowed on its quiet shore. Ruth had her book of stars. Eleanor's letter was on its way. The children's paper lantern turned on its red thread. The blue cups waited on their shelf. Nothing called to be solved. Nothing had been lost. A forgotten name had returned to the ledger. An old house had opened its windows, and one small lamp had been lit before dark. Mara turned toward home. The town streets were empty, their windows warm behind drawn curtains. A maple leaf moved along the sidewalk ahead of her, pushed gently by the night breeze, then came to rest beside a garden wall. Above the roofs, the stars remained clear. Mara knew only a few of their names, but tonight that was enough. She walked slowly beneath them, carrying the calm rhythm of the lake within her, while behind her the boats rested, the islands rested, the houses rested, and the long dark water held every reflection without needing to keep it. By morning, frost would silver the docks and gardens. The bakery would open. Elias would make coffee. Somewhere far to the north, a girl would wake in the lantern house, find her grandmother waiting with 2 blue cups, and ask which stars they had seen. But morning was not here yet. This hour belonged to the soft streets, the closed books, the cooling stoves, and the deep lake under the moon. This hour asked nothing. It carried nothing forward. It simply rested where it was, wide and quiet, until every window dimmed and every room became still.